The gray morning light filtered through the small window of the processing center at Camp Stoneman in California as Kim Minji, a 23-year-old Korean woman captured during the chaotic retreat of North Korean forces in October 1950, stared in disbelief at what lay before her. It was January 7, 1951, and after months of transport from Korea to Japan and finally to American soil, she stood frozen, unable to process what the American female officer was offering her. Hot water, soap, a clean towel, a razor. These simple items, presented as routine necessities, might as well have been precious gems for their rarity in her experience. What Kim saw in that moment defied 23 years of understanding about Americans, the supposed barbaric imperialists who, according to years of propaganda, lived in primitive conditions and treated prisoners with savage cruelty. "I thought it was a trick," she would later write, in a letter smuggled back to her sister in Pyongyang. "I waited for them to laugh and take it away, to show it was just another form of psychological torture. But they just stood there, waiting patiently for me to take the items, as if offering such luxury to a prisoner of war was completely normal." The American woman sergeant, noticing Kim's hesitation, demonstrated by turning on the tap, allowing steaming water to flow freely into the basin. She washed her own hands with the soap, then dried them on the clean white towel. She gestured again for Kim to take the items. With trembling hands, Kim accepted them, still convinced this must be an elaborate deception. But as the hot water ran over her fingers, hot water, available at the simple turn of a handle, not water painstakingly heated over precious fuel, after hours of collection from a distant source, the first crack appeared in the foundation of everything she had been taught to believe about America. "Use as much as you need," the sergeant said, through an interpreter. "There's plenty more." Those 4 simple words, "there's plenty more," would come to haunt Kim and hundreds of other Korean women, prisoners as they gradually discovered that what they had been told about America was not merely exaggerated propaganda, but a complete inversion of reality. What began with the shock of basic hygiene items would expand into a wholesale collapse of their ideological understanding as they witnessed firsthand the casual abundance of their captors, an abundance so routine that Americans considered it unremarkable. The story of Korean women prisoners of war in American custody represents one of the most profound examples of how material reality can shatter ideological indoctrination. These women, primarily from North Korea, but also including South Korean women who had been conscripted or volunteered for the North Korean cause, had been raised on a strict diet of anti-American propaganda. The United States was portrayed as a failing imperial power, a nation of desperate inequality where workers starved while the rich hoarded basic necessities. American soldiers were depicted as brutal savages, and American technology as inferior knockoffs of Soviet achievements. The seeds of this indoctrination had been planted well before the outbreak of hostilities on June 25, 1950, when North Korean forces surged across the 38th parallel. Following Japan's defeat in World War II, the Korean peninsula had been divided along this parallel, with the Soviet Union occupying the north and the United States occupying the south. By 1948, separate governments had been established, the Communist Democratic People's Republic of Korea in the north under Kim Il-sung, and the American-backed Republic of Korea in the south under Syngman Rhee. In North Korea, the Soviet-inspired regime had implemented extensive propaganda campaigns describing the United States as a crumbling empire of capitalism. Official publications like Rodong Sinmun regularly featured stories about American poverty, racial strife, and economic collapse. Children's textbooks depicted Americans as physically deformed by capitalism, with citizens suffering from malnutrition, while a tiny elite lived in luxury. "We were taught that ordinary Americans could not afford soap," recalled Park Soon-ja, another female prisoner captured while serving as a field nurse with the Korean People's Army's 45th Division. "Our instructors explained that in America, basic hygiene was a luxury reserved for the wealthy, and that most Americans suffered from diseases caused by poor sanitation. The comparison between the supposed prosperity of North Korea and the imagined squalor of America was a central theme in this propaganda. North Korean citizens were told their nation was rapidly developing into an industrial powerhouse, outpacing the decadent West. Statistics were regularly published showing North Korean production surpassing American output in everything from steel to textiles. While North Korea did achieve some impressive industrial growth in the immediate post-war years, these statistics were wildly exaggerated. For the women who would later become prisoners, this worldview seemed plausible. Most had grown up during the Japanese occupation and the subsequent Korean War, where genuine hardship was common. Shortages of food, clothing, and basic necessities were routine. In this context, the idea that Americans also face similar or worse conditions seemed believable. The women who found themselves in American custody came from diverse backgrounds. Some, like Kim Min-ji, had served as support personnel in the Korean People's Army, working as nurses, communication specialists, or administrative staff. Others had been caught in the massive population movements that characterized the war, as millions of Koreans fled the fighting. A smaller number had actively participated in combat, serving in specialized women's units or as part of the irregular forces. Their capture typically occurred during major North Korean retreats after the Incheon landing in September 1950, which reversed the initial North Korean advances, or during the chaotic period following China's entry into the war in November 1950, which pushed United Nations forces back below the 38th parallel. As the front line surged back and forth across the Korean peninsula, thousands of military personnel and civilians were captured by both sides. The United States was initially unprepared for the large number of prisoners, and especially for female prisoners. While male POWs were often held in large camps on the Korean peninsula itself, most female prisoners were evacuated to Japan and eventually to the United States. This was partly for their protection, as conditions in the hastily established Korean peninsula camps could be chaotic, but also reflected American uncertainty about how to handle female enemy combatants. By early 1951, approximately 800 Korean women had been transferred to specialized sections of POW facilities in California, primarily at Camp Stoneman near San Francisco and Fort Mason. These women arrived with deeply entrenched beliefs about what awaited them in captivity. North Korean propaganda had vividly described the torture, starvation, and sexual abuse that supposedly characterized American POW camps. Many expected to be worked to death or subjected to medical experimentation. What they encountered instead was the first of many shocks that would ultimately undermine their entire belief system. And it began with something as simple as hot water and soap. The first bath I took in the American camp lasted nearly an hour, wrote Lee Youngja in a debriefing interview conducted after the war. I kept waiting for someone to tell me to hurry, to conserve the hot water. No one did. When I finally emerged, I asked the guard through an interpreter when hot water would be available again. She looked confused and said, "Anytime you want. The showers are open from 6 in the morning until 10 at night." I didn't believe her. In my village, we had heated water once a week if fuel was available, and it was never more than a small basin full. This encounter with unlimited hot water was just the beginning. The systematic shock continued as the women prisoners were processed into the American POW system. Each received a complete medical examination, often the most thorough medical attention they had ever received. They were given dental care, vaccinations, and treatment for conditions ranging from malnutrition to tuberculosis. The doctor spent 20 minutes examining just my teeth, recalled Choi Soon-hee, who had served as a communication specialist with North Korean forces. He seemed genuinely angry about their condition. Through the interpreter, he kept asking what kind of dental care I had received before. When I explained that there had been one dentist for our entire district and that most problems were solved by extraction, he shook his head in disbelief. He immediately scheduled me for 6 separate dental procedures using materials and techniques I had never seen before. the medical care extended beyond immediate needs. Women with chronic conditions received ongoing treatment. Those with nutritional deficiencies were given supplements. Even cosmetic issues were addressed, a concept utterly foreign to prisoners from a country where basic survival medical care was often unavailable. Park Ji-yeon, captured near the Chosun Reservoir in December 1950, described her bewilderment at American medical priorities. "I had a burn scar on my arm from a childhood accident. It never occurred to me that anything could be done about it. It was simply part of my body." The American doctor asked if I wanted it revised, a word the interpreter had trouble translating. Eventually, I understood he was offering to make it less visible, purely for aesthetic reasons. The idea that medical resources would be used for something that caused no pain or disability, and on an enemy prisoner no less, was incomprehensible to me. The systematic disorientation continued with the issue of food. The standard American military diet provided to the prisoners represented a caloric intake approximately 3 times what most had regularly consumed in North Korea. The variety was equally shocking. Many prisoners reported never having seen certain foods before, or having seen them only as luxury items reserved for high-party officials. The first meal they served us included white bread, butter, jam, eggs, bacon, and orange juice, wrote Kim Min-ji. I had seen white bread only once before, at a party for visiting Soviet officials. The butter was completely foreign to me. The quantity of food on a single plate was more than I sometimes had in an entire day at home. I was suspicious, certain this was a display meal to impress us, and that regular rations would be much smaller. But the next meal was equally abundant, and the next, and the next. The women were housed in barracks that, while simple by American standards, featured amenities many had never experienced: indoor plumbing, electricity available 24 hours a day, consistent heating, and individual beds with clean sheets and blankets. These conditions stood in stark contrast to the overcrowded, often unheated housing that was standard in North Korea, where multiple families frequently shared small homes with minimal amenities. "They gave each of us 2 blankets, recalled Park Soon-ja. "I tried to return one, assuming it had been given to me by mistake. The guard seemed confused and said through the interpreter that I could have a 3rd blanket if I was cold. In that moment, I began to understand that the scarcity I had lived with my entire life was not universal. Perhaps most disorienting was the casual attitude Americans displayed toward this abundance. To them, these conditions were not luxurious or even comfortable. They were basic minimums, provided as a matter of course even to enemy prisoners. This realization often proved more ideologically devastating than the material conditions themselves. It was one thing to discover that Americans had more resources than North Koreans. It was another entirely to realize that what constituted desperate poverty by American standards exceeded what passed for comfort in North Korea. The process of ideological undermining continued as the women observed the conditions of their American guards, particularly the female military personnel who primarily staffed the women's sections of the POW camps. These American service women, primarily from working-class backgrounds, displayed a level of material prosperity that seemed impossible. Choi Sun-hee described her fascination with an American corporal named Jenkins who supervised her barracks. She had 4 pairs of shoes. 4. She had multiple uniforms plus civilian clothes for when she was off duty. She owned a camera, a watch, and a radio. These were possessions that in North Korea would mark someone as extraordinarily wealthy. Yet she spoke of saving money to buy a car when her service ended, as though that was a reasonable ambition for an ordinary person. The gap between propaganda and reality became increasingly difficult to reconcile as the women observed more of American life, even from the confines of a POW camp. They watched as ordinary soldiers received packages from home containing items that would have been valuable luxuries in North Korea: chocolate, coffee, magazines, clothing, which the soldiers sometimes consumed casually or even discarded. I saw an American guard throw away half a chocolate bar because she said she was watching her figure, wrote Lee Young-ja. I had tasted chocolate once in my life at a Children's Day celebration, and had been given a piece the size of my thumbnail, which I let melt in my mouth over the course of an hour to make it last. The casual discarding of such a treasure made me question everything I had been told about American poverty. The initial shock of material abundance gradually expanded into a more profound realization about American industrial capacity. The prisoners were permitted limited access to newspapers, magazines, and even supervised trips to nearby towns as part of the American strategy to expose them to Western democracy. What they saw fundamentally challenged their understanding of global power dynamics. Kim Minji described a supervised visit to a department store in San Francisco in June 1951. The abundance was physically painful to witness. One store contained more goods than I had seen in my entire life. There were 50 different types of canned food on a single shelf. The clothing department had hundreds of dresses, all new, all available without ration coupons. I asked our interpreter how many party officials shopped at this store. She laughed and explained this was a store for ordinary people. When I saw the prices, I calculated how many years a North Korean worker would need to labor to afford a single item. It was then I realized we had been fighting a nation so wealthy that what they considered accessible to everyone was beyond the reach of even our elites. The evidence of American productive capacity was overwhelming. Prisoners witnessed the constant construction and expansion of facilities, the regular arrival of supplies, and the mechanization of tasks that in their homeland would have required substantial manual labor. The contrast with the struggling North Korean economy, further devastated by war, could not have been more stark. We were told that American factories had been destroyed in World War II and that their production was crippled, wrote Park Ji-yeon. Yet everywhere I looked, I saw evidence of immense manufacturing capability. New vehicles arrived regularly. Construction equipment appeared whenever needed. Even the simplest tasks were accomplished with specialized tools. One day, I watched in amazement as workers installed a new power line to our camp. In 3 hours, they accomplished what would have taken a North Korean crew 3 weeks. The statistical reality behind these observations was indeed staggering. In 1950, the United States produced approximately 92 million tons of steel, while North Korea's much-vaunted steel industry produced less than 1 million tons. American electrical generation capacity exceeded 300 billion kilowatt-hours, while North Korea struggled to generate 5 billion kilowatt-hours. A single American automobile plant could produce more vehicles in a month than North Korea could manufacture in years. These production disparities translated directly into military capability. The women had fought for an army that struggled constantly with shortages of ammunition, fuel, and equipment. They now found themselves in the custody of a military that seemed to have unlimited supplies of everything. The logistics alone were mind-boggling. During one air raid in North Korea, we had to carefully collect unexploded American bombs to salvage the explosive material, recalled Choi Sun-hee. We were told each bomb represented precious resources that weakened the American war effort. Then I arrived at an American base and saw bombs stacked like firewood, more than I could count, with new shipments arriving daily. I realized then that each bomb dropped on us cost them nothing in relative terms. They had thousands more. We had been measuring their resources by our standards, and we were entirely wrong. The scale of American medical support particularly impressed the Korean women, many of whom had served as military or civilian medical personnel. The contrast between the two systems was devastating to their professional pride and national identity. Park Soon-ja, who had worked as a field nurse, described her first visit to an American military hospital. They had antibiotics in such quantities that they were given for minor infections. We had been saving penicillin for only the most serious cases, often diluting it to treat more patients. They had blood plasma, X-ray machines, surgical equipment I had never seen before. Their medical textbooks contained information completely unknown to us. I had believed our medical system was advanced, based on Soviet science. I realized that we were practicing medicine from the previous century, while the Americans had moved far beyond us. The evidence of American advancement extended beyond military applications. The prisoners observed agricultural techniques that produced yields many times what North Korean farms could achieve. They saw infrastructure, roads, bridges, power systems, built to standards that seemed impossibly high. Even basic amenities like plumbing and electrical systems displayed a level of development that made North Korean facilities seem primitive by comparison. Lee Young-ja, who had worked in a textile factory before the war, was permitted to visit an American clothing factory as part of a supervised educational program. Their machines could produce in one day what would take our factory a month. The quality was higher, the materials better, and the working conditions incomparably superior. The American workers complained about conditions we would have considered luxurious. They had paid sick leave, safety equipment, and scheduled breaks. They worked 8-hour days with 2 days off each week. I had been working 12-hour days, 7 days a week, with 1 day off per month. The mounting evidence of American material superiority created profound cognitive dissonance for the prisoners. Many initially resisted the implications, developing elaborate explanations to preserve their ideological framework. Some insisted they were being shown carefully constructed showcases, rather than typical American conditions. Others maintained that while America might be materially wealthy, it remained spiritually and morally impoverished. I told myself that what I was seeing must be the result of American exploitation of other countries, wrote Kim Min-ji, that their wealth came from stealing resources from nations like ours. It was the only explanation that allowed me to maintain any belief in what I had been taught. But as the months passed, I saw that even this explanation was inadequate. The scale of production was too vast to be explained by mere theft. There was genuine creation of wealth occurring through means my education had never prepared me to understand. The psychological impact of this realization was often devastating. The prisoners had built their identities around a particular understanding of their nation's place in the world. To discover that this understanding was based on fabrications meant confronting the possibility that their sacrifices, and for many, the deaths of loved ones, had been based on lies. Some responded with anger, directing their rage at the North Korean leadership that had deceived them. Others fell into depression as their worldview collapsed. Many experienced a profound sense of betrayal, questioning everything they had been taught. A significant number began actively seeking information about the outside world, suddenly desperate to understand the reality they had been denied. The American authorities, recognizing the potential intelligence and propaganda value of these shifting perspectives, developed programs specifically designed to further the prisoners' education about the United States. These included English language classes, vocational training, and carefully supervised exposure to American media and civilian life. These programs accelerated the transformation already underway. Women who had arrived as committed opponents of American imperialism gradually became students of the system they had been taught to hate. Their questions evolved from hostile skepticism to genuine curiosity. Many began keeping journals documenting the contradictions between what they had been told and what they observed. Choi Sun-hee described this transition in a diary entry from September 1951. Today, I asked Technical Sergeant Williams how ordinary Americans afford automobiles. In North Korea, only the highest party officials have personal vehicles. She explained about bank loans, payment plans, and how most families in her neighborhood owned at least one car. When I expressed disbelief, she brought photographs of her street showing a car in front of almost every house. These were not wealthy people. They were factory workers, teachers, shopkeepers. I cannot reconcile this with what we were told about American workers barely surviving in desperate poverty. The change manifested physically as well as mentally. Medical records from the POW camps document remarkable improvements in the women's health. Average weight increased by 23 pounds during the first 6 months of captivity. Chronic conditions like anemia, malnutrition, and tuberculosis showed dramatic improvement. Dental health transformed. Even height increased among younger prisoners who had not completed their growth, suggesting their development had been stunted by nutritional deficiencies. I did not recognize myself after 6 months in the camp, wrote Park Ji-yoon. My hair became thicker, my skin clearer. I gained weight and strength. The constant hunger that had been my companion for as long as I could remember disappeared. I had blamed my frequent illnesses on overwork and bad luck, never realizing they were the result of malnutrition and poor living conditions. As their physical health improved, many prisoners experienced a parallel transformation in outlook. The initial shock gave way to curiosity, and for some, to genuine admiration. They began requesting more information about American society, economy, and government. Some started making plans for what they would do after repatriation, often involving attempts to bring American ideas or practices back to Korea. This shifting perspective created difficult choices as the possibility of repatriation became real during peace negotiations. By 1952, with armistice talks underway at Panmunjom, prisoners on both sides faced decisions about whether to return to their homelands. For the Korean women in American custody, this represented an agonizing dilemma. To return meant going back to conditions they now understood to be artificially impoverished. It meant keeping silent about what they had seen, or worse, being accused of spreading enemy propaganda if they spoke the truth. Yet not returning meant permanent separation from family and homeland, becoming strangers in a foreign culture. The statistics tell a revealing story. Of the approximately 800 Korean women held as prisoners in the United States, 327, more than 40%, ultimately chose not to return to North Korea. This was a significantly higher percentage than among male prisoners, suggesting the women's direct exposure to American society through the specialized programs had a more profound impact on their worldview. Those who chose repatriation faced substantial challenges upon their return. Many were treated with suspicion, subjected to re-education, and closely monitored for signs of ideological contamination. Their improved health and appearance sometimes worked against them, serving as visible evidence of their experience in enemy hands. Lee Young-ja, who returned to North Korea in 1953, later escaped to South Korea in 1971 and provided testimony about the treatment of repatriated prisoners. We were told never to speak of what we had seen in America. Anyone who mentioned the material conditions or questioned official accounts was sent for intensive political education. Several women disappeared entirely after making comparisons between American and North Korean living standards. The authorities were more afraid of our words than they had been of American bombs. Those who remained in the United States or migrated to South Korea often became cultural bridges, using their unique perspective to interpret between East and West. Many pursued education and careers that would have been impossible in North Korea, particularly for women. They raised families, built businesses, and integrated into their new societies while maintaining a distinct identity shaped by their extraordinary experiences. Kim Min-ji, who settled in California after the war, founded a Korean-American cultural association that helped later waves of Korean immigrants adjust to American life. I understood the shock they experienced, the disorientation of abundance after scarcity. I had lived through that transformation myself, but without guidance. I wanted to help others navigate that difficult transition. The legacy of these women extends beyond their individual stories. They represent one of the most dramatic examples of how direct exposure to material reality can overcome even the most comprehensive ideological indoctrination. Their experience demonstrates that propaganda cannot indefinitely withstand the evidence of lived experience. The contrast that began with simple hot water, soap, and a razor ultimately expanded to encompass entire worldviews. For these women, the shock of American hygiene standards in POW camps was merely the first crack in a dam that eventually broke completely, flooding them with a new understanding of their place in the global order. In the decades since the Korean War, North Korea has doubled down on isolation, limiting its citizens' exposure to the outside world far more comprehensively than was possible in the 1950s. This suggests an institutional understanding of the danger posed by direct comparison, a lesson learned, perhaps, from the experience of those female prisoners whose beliefs could not survive contact with a bar of soap and unlimited hot water. The power of material reality to shape belief represents one of the most potent forces in human psychology. For Kim Min-ji and hundreds of women like her, that reality began with the shock of good hygiene and expanded to encompass an entirely new understanding of possibility. Their journey from indoctrination to enlightenment underscores a fundamental truth, that seeing, touching, and experiencing will always ultimately triumph over being told what to believe. As Park Soon-ja wrote in her final letter to family in North Korea, before cutting contact for their safety, "I have seen another world, and having seen it, I can never again believe what I once accepted without question." The greatest weapon in this war was not the atomic bomb, but the humble bar of soap that revealed the magnitude of our deception. I hope someday you will understand that I cannot unknow what I have learned and that my silence is the only gift I can offer you now.